Please be seated. "20 years ago today, that is 20 years ago from the first Sunday following 9/11, I sat like this in my church. I was not in the pulpit, but on a high stool in the nave, at the level of the people in the pews. After several days of stewing over what and how to preach after that horrendous, unimaginable assault, I felt that even the separation between preacher and people in the pews was too much from the pulpit. In our shock and our grief, we needed to be closer together. We needed more intimacy. And so, I perched on my stool with a small stack of note cards in case I lost my way. It was the very first time I had ever attempted preaching without a manuscript. Now, today, the small stack of note cards is replaced by the iPad, and I may have to look at it more often because 20 years has made my memory a little less dependable. But today, I do it again because 2 decades later, I have a similar feeling. I have the feeling that the world is out of control. Oh, I imagine it's partly the reminders of that autumn day in 2001, the day that so many people described as starting out dazzlingly beautiful with the sun and the cloudless sky, even in New York City. We have been hearing again the stories of where we were when the unfathomable news began to break and the horror continued to play out in those hours and days that followed. Since, well, all week perhaps, maybe more than that, we have been hearing on news media various examinations of what has happened in these 20 years since, and how it's affected the world that we live in now in 2021. There's the remembrance, of course, of the humanity and the unity that we experienced in the immediate aftermath of the attack, along with the hope that that was going to last, that those who poured into the churches for prayer and for comfort after the attacks would stay, and that our churches would be filled again. And that ultimately goodness would prevail and the world would move forward more gently with compassion and understanding for one another. I think it was David Brooks on Friday night's PBS NewsHour who talked about how the last years of the 20th century seemed to be moving in that kind of a direction. There was the fall of the Iron Curtain, the taking down of the Berlin Wall, perhaps signaling a new cooperation in an increasingly global society. But then the shock of 9/11 came along. And along with that, the stunning realization that there were those who did not admire our country, our democratic society, and indeed wanted to destroy it. How could this be, we thought? How could this be, as we were part of the most powerful and free country the world had ever known? Another commentator this week spoke of these ensuing years as one giant forward step and 2 back. Forward steps with the election of the first person of color as President of the United States, the legal and ecclesial inclusion of LGBTQI individuals and couples, and just in this past year or so, in the midst of violence and pain, of domestic terrorism, the growing acknowledgement and outcry about the injustices that our nation is engaged in, perpetuating racial discrimination, treatment of those Native Americans who occupied this land before it was discovered and stolen. The backward steps, backlashes against all of the above, a growing resistance by those whose power and privilege is threatened by making good on the promise of freedom and justice for all people. The misinformation, the violence. We find ourselves this week in September 2021, a divided nation, a divided world, divided on our role in world affairs, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, China, Korea, divided on overcoming the pandemic, vaccination mandates, divided on voting rights and immigration, divided on when human life begins and who gets to control reproductive rights, divided on the very nature of freedom itself, individual freedom or what benefits the common good. Where do we go from here? Do we shrug our shoulders, hunker down in whatever comfortable space we can make, and close ourselves off from the overwhelming changes and chances of life? Or do we follow Jesus and go back to his challenging and hard words to his disciples, to the 12, to the others around him, and indeed to all of us 2 millennia later? Our gospel reading today is a turning point in Jesus' ministry. Jesus is healed, he's taught, he's fed the multitudes, and in doing so, he has attracted many, many followers. Now he asks the big question, who do the people say I am? And then, focusing it, who do you say that I am? And Peter, always the bold one, you are the Messiah. Probably pretty proud of himself at that point. And he does have the right answer. But it becomes clear very quickly that his concept of what the Messiah is not at all what Jesus means. There will be no immediate healing of the world, no glorious takeover or restoration of a kind of Garden of Eden. It will, instead, include suffering and rejection, both for Jesus and for those who ultimately follow him. Because what Jesus brings, what God desires for all humanity, threatens the power and the privilege of those who have misused it. To change the world will mean taking up crosses. Discipleship has a cost. Jesus warns those who are ashamed of him and his words. This is very hard to hear. And I wonder how many in that crowd stayed to listen. How many found that they had an urgent errand to attend to elsewhere? Who do we say Jesus is? Does it really matter how we answer? Whether we follow a Jesus who is merely a tender shepherd who seeks us out in our lostness to comfort us and bring us home, or whether we follow a Jesus who demands something from us, demands everything, all of us. Maybe Jesus' message heard this way makes us want to join those who ran off from the crowd. For the stakes are high with our answer. It is about choosing life or death. Am I getting a new message? Listen once again. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? That losing life is a death of sorts, but it's a death in this life, a dying to oneself, one's self-interest, one's belief in being independent and in control, able to handle any of life's challenges by oneself. Life is about acknowledging vulnerability and need, and choosing to love God and one another and walk in God's ways. Loving one another is about listening to, caring for, and attending to others' pain, even when the other is unlike us and far from our own circle of acquaintance. For we all bear the image of God. We all share a common humanity that laughs and cries, that loves and is wounded, that hopes and despairs. How about you? Will you run off for the crowd? Or will you take up the cross? I'm reminded of Jesus' wistful question in our reading from John's Gospel just a few weeks ago. Do you also wish to go away? And Peter's answer, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life.